So this is mostly going to be kind of Mac focused, I'm sorry. But for those of us on Mac, we're going to be using Homebrew to install Postgres. Allegedly, you can use Homebrew on other systems now too, but I would recommend using a package manager that's more specific to your operating system. It's probably a better way that you can install Postgres on Windows than using Homebrew. But for those of us on Mac, we're going to start off, brew install Postgres. I already have Postgres, so this is not going to do anything for me. But for some of you who don't have it yet, this might take a few minutes. Okay, there we go. Postgres is already installed and up to date, so that was pretty quick for me. For you all, this might take a lot longer because Homebrew is kind of slow sometimes. That's all right. So now I installed Postgres, and that gives me access to this Postgres command line tool, but it gives me a few other things as well. So we're going to see this later on in this demo, but there's a psql command line command I have now. initdb is another command I got. So just installing this one thing, I've added actually a few different commands available in my command line. But the first one that we're going to learn about is the Postgres command, which is just used for starting my database server at the command line. So I want to put some emphasis on that language that I'm using, database server. So previously we were learning about like the Django server, which just sits around waiting, listening for HTTP requests to send a response. The database is similar. It's also a server. It's a process that just sits around waiting and listening for requests. And then when it gets a request for data, it sends a response with the data that was requested. So we're going to have to start a server using the Postgres command. But there's actually a couple steps that we have to do before we can start our server. So Postgres needs to have a folder on your computer where it stores all of your data. This is called the data directory. So by default, if you installed Postgres through Homebrew, this is going to be in user local var Postgres. So I'll just ls. This is the Postgres data directory. There's a lot of files in here. I don't expect you to understand most of them, but there's one thing in here that you should be aware of. PostgreSQL.conf. This is your main Postgres config file. So if you see this file, this is how you can know this is the Postgres data directory. I'm in the right spot. And also, there may come a time when you have to change the settings for Postgres. For the most part, the default settings for Postgres are great, and we're not going to need to change them at any point in this cohort, in this program, while you're at Platoon. But this is definitely something that I've had to work with for a lot of jobs that I've had where I've interacted with databases. Sometimes we find some obscure reason why the default settings don't work for us. And so you need to change something in the data directory, in the config file. So this is what that looks like. So you notice all the hash signs on the left side. This file is entirely comments. So there's actually no code in this config file. It's just showing you what you could configure. These are just potential things that you could set and the default options. So, you know, if I wanted to set something for SSL passphrase command, I just uncomment this line and then put some code in here. It kind of saves you a little bit of trouble of looking up everything you could possibly put in the config file. So they give you kind of an example config file with everything commented out. But again, you don't need to understand everything that's in here. It's more just if you encounter a problem in the future and you read online, you know, put this code in your Postgres config file. Now you know that this is what that file is, this is where it is, and this is the Postgres data directory, in case you need that, which you're going to need in just 2 seconds. All right, so I said before, by default, this is the data directory for Postgres. You might not have a data directory, or it might be somewhere else, depending on just how you installed Postgres, because there are a lot of other ways to install it not using Homebrew. So that's what the initdb command is for. So I showed you 2 seconds, but this command is included when I install Postgres. If I run this command in a folder, it'll basically set that folder up to be my Postgres data directory. So it'll just copy and paste everything you see here into that folder. So if this is not where I want my data directory, or just wasn't set up for some reason, you can create it. But I'm hoping that you won't need to do that. The next thing that all of you will need to do, though, is you need to tell Postgres where the data directory is. So even though it has this default location, user local var Postgres, Postgres is not going to assume that the data directory was installed in the default location. I think that's a little strange. I think that would be a fair assumption to make, but we do have to tell Postgres where the data directory is. And we do that with an environment variable. So I'm just going to show you what my bash RC looks like real quick. Or my bash profile, I'm sorry. So critically, the last line is where I'm telling Postgres where my data folder is. The export PG data. This is not a variable name that I invented. This is a specific environment variable name that Postgres is looking for. Just every time you start a Postgres, it says like, okay, great, where's my data? How do I know what I'm doing? It needs to have a folder that stores all its data. And this is how we tell Postgres where that is. It looks at our environment variable. And this is how I'm setting it in my bash profile. I'm just setting that to be equal to this default data directory. This is where just Brew puts it when I install Postgres with Homebrew. If I manually put the data directory somewhere else, I would have to specify that here. But this is what I got for now. Okay, so given that I've installed Postgres and I have declared the data directory in my bash profile, I can now start my database server. So the way I do that is just by typing Postgres. You get a little bit of output. Most importantly, though, is the last line. Database system is ready to accept connections. So again, this is a server that I just started. It is sitting and listening and waiting for someone to send a request to it so it can give a response. And if I wanted it to stop doing this, I can just crash out with Control-C. We've seen that before for exiting out of other command line programs. So there I just did Control-C. You can see it received a fast shutdown request. And so it tries to clean up as best it can, and then shuts down. Let's start it back up again. Okay, we're ready to accept connections. So this is my database server, Postgres here. Now we need a database client, how we actually connect to the database server and send it queries. So I'm gonna open up another tab because this tab is occupied right now. This is not going to do anything. This is busy. It's running the server. So I need to open up a new tab in order to do any work. Go over here. So now the program that I use to access my server is called psql. Now psql needs a few pieces of information to connect to the database. But fortunately, we can just use the defaults for most of those. So it needs to know the port that we're connecting on, but the default port 5432 is correct in this case. so I don't need to specify that. I have to specify, the machine it's connecting to, but that's just localhost. That's the default, so I don't need to specify that. The only thing I do actually need to specify at the command line to let psql to connect to my database is to say which database I'm connecting to. Because you can have multiple databases on your system, and you can't just connect to Postgres generally. You have to connect to some specific database. Can anyone see a problem with this though, so far? I've just installed Postgres and I'm telling you that I can't use psql unless we have a specific database I'm connecting to.
I think when you install it, it creates a default database. At least for me, if I just type psql and then enter, it works because it's using that default database. But generally, you'd have to create one.
So we do. I think you gave me the solution there. I'm not sure if I got the question, but yeah, the problem here is that we have kind of a chicken and egg situation. Is that I want to use psql to create a database, but I can't connect to my database with psql unless I connect to an existing database. So the solution to this chicken egg situation, you're correct. There is a default database that already exists that I can connect to. And I'm going to connect to that and then create other databases. So I'm just going to try calling psql with the defaults. And that's actually going to give me an error. So let's actually take a moment and read this error. Failed to connect to the socket. Database, Rafael Sirota does not exist. So what is Rafael Sirota in this context? That's my user account on this machine. So the default behavior for Postgres, for psql, is if you try to connect to a database, you don't specify the database name, it's going to use the name of your user account. So in a lot of situations, this actually makes sense. For a server deployment of Postgres, this is actually kind of the smartest, most useful default option. But for us just learning this and developing it locally, this isn't what we want, because I don't have a database called Rafael Sirota. The default database in Postgres is called Postgres. So in order to connect to my local database using psql, I'm going to actually have to specify that name of the default database, psql Postgres. And now I'm connected. So now you can see I've got a different prompt. It says Postgres equals, and then this hash sign. That's what the Postgres prompt looks like. So now I've got a SQL prompt to a specific database, and I can just run any SQL commands. But I don't really want to make changes to the Postgres database. So the very next thing I'm going to do is create a new database. The command for that is pretty simple. So let's imagine this is a database for a school. I'm just going to call it school. I've already done this apparently just in preparing for this demo. And so that database already exists. But you can imagine if I did this for the first time, we wouldn't have an error there. If I want to prove that I actually did this correctly, I can ask psql to show me my existing databases. So all of the psql meta commands start with a backslash. So this is not a SQL query. This is specific to psql in this command line program I'm using. \L is list databases. This is the school database that I just created, that I just attempted to create that already existed. Postgres is the default database that already exists when you install Postgres. Template 0 and template 1 are also pre-installed. Those are also default databases. I'm not 100% sure what those are for. I think there was a time when I used to know, but I've forgotten it because I used them once. I would just recommend you not touch them, just kind of leave them as they are. If you need a default database to log into, Postgres is fine, then just create your own database afterwards. But anyways, I've created a database, school. So now I'm going to connect to that database. I could either connect to it directly from where I'm at, but maybe a little bit simpler, just to reuse commands that we've already seen. I'm going to quit out first. So that's \q, gets me out of psql. Now I'm back at the regular command line. And now I can psql school, and that takes me to my school database. So now I have a different prompt. Before it was Postgres equals pound. Now it is school equals pound. Slightly different prompt because I'm now using the school database. If let's say I just joined a new company or whatever, and I have no idea what all this data is, I'm trying to understand it better. A command that I can use to describe these tables is \d. So just typing that by itself, that's going to list basically everything that's in my current database. Some of these are things we don't care about. I'm mostly interested in the tables. Some of these are also sequences. I'm not exactly sure why these show up in the same list, but this is basically saying, like, when we have those automatically incrementing IDs that start at 1 for our records and then just count up every time we insert something, that is, there's a separate table that Postgres creates. Not exactly a table, but there's some structure that Postgres creates to keep track of those IDs, just to know what the next one in the sequence is. So that shows up in this view. If we want a more specific output, we can say DT. I think of this as describe tables. So here it's a slightly different table. This shows me all the different tables in my database. This might seem like a bunch of tables for just a small test app. A lot of these are created automatically by Django. Actually, all but one of these are created automatically by Django. So Django does a lot to just automatically keep your database nice and orderly. And part of that is it has a bunch of its own tables that it manages automatically. You don't really have to think too hard about these, but just don't get surprised when you see them in your database, and know that you should not touch them. Just let Django manage them the way it's expecting to. Yeah, so the one table that I think should actually have interesting stuff is attendance student. Let's see what I can select here. Apparently there's actually nothing there. So I'm curious about what this table is supposed to hold. So I'm going to use \d and then the table name. And again, I do this all the time in my first couple of weeks at a new job. I'm just trying to understand the shape of their data. So I'll use this command \d on all their tables, and it's going to show me the schema for that table. So these are the columns: ID, name, email. The types for the columns, you have an integer and then 2 varchars. And then all of these are set as not null. So these 3 fields are all required data. So let's see if I can insert into this table. Insert into attendance student. So I'm not inserting the ID because that gets set automatically. Just setting the name and email. Values are going to be Alice and alice@here.com. Okay, so I inserted. So this output here, this means that it was successful. We successfully inserted 1 record into the database. That was definitely what I was trying to do. When you're doing like an update or delete, this should also be 1 to indicate that you updated or deleted 1 record or just however many you were intending. If this is like a 3 or 4 digit number, you should maybe be concerned. Now let's try that select statement again. So now I can see that student who I just inserted, Alice. She got an ID automatically because that's what this next val sequence does. And then she's got the name and email that I inserted here. So that's as much as I want to show you about psql right now. You're probably going to dig into that a little bit this evening and maybe as you're debugging throughout the week. I want to show you something else though about how your server actually runs on your machine. So here I've got, my server that I'm running, my Postgres server. I just want to point out that during this demo, I did a few things that didn't make sense. And I'm getting those errors here in this tab where I'm running my server. So it's possible to run your server in the background. I'm going to show you that in just 2 minutes. But while you're learning about Postgres and while you're developing and debugging, I think it's really valuable to actually have your server in the foreground, just like right here, occupying this terminal tab permanently. Because that way, when you do something wrong, when Postgres throws an error, you're going to see it right here. So, I wasn't able to connect before because the database Rafael server doesn't exist. Got this error that the school database didn't exist. A lot of errors that might be easy to miss when you're running your database through your application will show up right here. So I really can't tell you how many times it's happened to me professionally that like someone like wrote a bug into the database code and it got into production and like took some service down and the whole company had to join a meeting to figure out what went wrong. And it turns out that the problem was the developer who wrote the feature didn't have their console open, didn't have their terminal open here. And the database was telling them exactly what was wrong and exactly what they needed to fix, and they just weren't reading the error message. So it's exactly the same as when you're doing front-end web development. You just need to have your console open and just be ready for errors to come so you can see what went wrong. If you don't have your console open, there's no way you're going to catch errors. So similarly with Postgres, I will encourage you to have your console open so you can see errors as they pop up. Was there a question just now? Saw a hand.
Yeah, so just a real quick question. So when we're doing the install, is this something you would recommend doing inside of the virtual environments individually, like how we do Django, or would having a global install be easy to manage?
Mm-hmm. So installing Postgres has nothing to do with your Django virtual environments because this is not a Python module. So whether you're in a virtual environment or not, that has no bearing on any of the commands that I've showed you today.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so I just tried to impress upon you why it's so important to actually keep the database console open, to actually read error messages when they happen, so you don't get stopped by a simple bug where your database is telling you exactly what you need to do to fix it. But for a variety of reasons, some people don't like doing this, and they might prefer other options for running their database. So I'm just going to show you a couple other ways you can do that. So I just hit Control-C, just close my database. It is no longer running. If I try to go back to psql, so if I try to do select star again, it's going to give me this error because I'm not actually connected anymore. Quit. If I try to connect again, it gives me this error. No such file or directory is kind of a strange error message. That's not really what I expect. But this question, I think, is a good question to be asked. Is the server running locally? No, it's not. That's why I can't connect. So given that I installed Postgres with Homebrew, you might prefer to start Postgres using Brew services. So kind of informally, a service on your machine is like a program that is always running in the background, even when you restart your computer. So I'm going to run brew services start Postgres. So now it says Postgres is running. If I want to check on that, I can do brew services list. And tells me that I have one service running currently. It is Postgres. It is started. It's really good to see started here in green. Sometimes you will tell Postgres to start and there will be an error somewhere and it's not even able to start. So you can see the status here is like pending or stopped or something. If I want to shut this down, there's brew services stop Postgres. So that's pretty helpful. If you're like really in the groove, you're not having any problems with your database and you just don't want to think about it too hard, using brew services is pretty nice because this will run Postgres in the background and it persists when you restart your computer. So, you can do a hard shutdown, boot it back up. Postgres is still going to be running in the background. You don't have to like manually manage it. Some people like that, but again, if I'm debugging something, then I'm going to run it in the foreground. If you're not running Postgres with Homebrew, another similar option is Pgctl Start, which is basically the same as Brew services start Postgres. There's also Pgctl Stop, which is the opposite of that. This is Postgres control. So this is a utility that's included with Postgres when we install it. I think this is good if you didn't use Homebrew to install Postgres, but if you did install Postgres with Homebrew, you would probably prefer Brew services over this because using Pgctl does not restart Postgres when your computer restarts, it just runs it in the background. So it's not quite as good as Brew services. Now, one last thing before I conclude today's lecture is I've seen some people run into problems sometimes where they're running processes in the background and then they get lost. So maybe like you run a server from VS Code in the terminal there, and then you close VS Code, but the server doesn't actually get shut down, but you no longer have access to that terminal, so you're not sure how to close it. I just want to show you one way that we can track down processes that you might have lost access to. So I'm going to start up Postgres again. So now it's running in the background. But now if I want to get information from my system about what's running in the background, I can use this command, ps. It stands for processes. By default, it's just going to show me my processes that are running in my terminal, which is not super useful. I've got 3 terminal tabs here. So it shows me 3 items. TTYS, this is my terminal tab. So terminal 0, terminal 1, terminal 2. That's what it's telling me about. Not super interesting. They're all running bash. If I want to see all the commands from all users, do ps-a. So this is going to show me a lot of other things other than just what I'm running in my terminal currently. And you'll notice for most of these, in the column for which terminal is this running in, TTY, it's just question mark, because it's not actually running in any terminal tab. It's in the background somewhere and got kind of forgotten. But this is a lot of output. It's a little bit hard for me to parse through all this with my eyes. So if I'm just trying to see, like, is Postgres running in the background, I'm going to use this command, pipe. So this is going to take the output of what's on the left and use it as the input for what's on the right. Pass that into grep, which is a command line tool for searching through text. And I'm going to search for the text Postgres. Let me clear my screen real quick. So this is going to get a list of all the processes running my computer and then filter them by the ones that have the word Postgres anywhere in that line. So this is a much shorter list. And this is showing me that, yes, Postgres is running. It's more than just one process on your machine, Postgres runs like, 5 or 6 processes simultaneously. And this is just showing me the process of me searching for Postgres, which is the command I just ran. But here is my actual database server running. This is showing Postgres. This is the full file path though, instead of just the one word. And then this is the data directory for Postgres. The -D is for data. So that's showing me that Postgres is running on my machine. If I want to stop this process, I see this process ID number is 61152. Can end that with kill 61152. Ideally, I shouldn't have to do that though. Like I should be able to use Brew service to stop Postgres or Postgres control stop. Didn't seem like it responded to the kill signal. So I might have to find a different approach for stopping it. The regular servers we were using before with just the Python-M HTTP server, those were going down with just regular kill. So you might need a different way to control it. Maybe kill isn't the right option here. My point is that if you have a process that is running in the background and you're not sure if it's still there, this is one way that you can check on it. Just have a greater understanding of what your machine is doing under the scenes. Because it can be kind of frustrating if you think you've installed Postgres and you're not really sure if it's running, and it seems like it might be kind of. I know a lot of frustrating bugs start like that, they sound like that. So this is one way that you can inspect your system a little bit more. So yeah, that's all I have to share with you about Postgres for today. I hope this gives you enough to get started on homework, and I hope everyone's able to install this successfully. I suspect some of the Windows users might have some shared troubles, so you might need to group up in a breakout room this afternoon and help each other out. I'm sorry I have not recently installed Postgres on a Windows machine. But yeah, that's databases in a nutshell. Does anybody have any questions before we break for the afternoon? Jim?
Yeah. On the curriculum for the instruction for installing Postgres, it says on one part that we need to tell Postgres where the data directory is.
Yep.
Could you kind of go over that?
Yeah. So remember a couple of days ago, I showed you about how you have an environment in the shell. You type env, and it shows you all these variables that are defined for your system. One of these variables needs to be pgdata. Because when Postgres starts, it tries to read this variable to figure out where all of its data is stored. So I know that because I did the default installation with Homebrew, that it put the data folder in user local var Postgres, and I visually verified that by doing ls in that directory. I saw what I was expecting. So now I just have to declare pgdata as a variable in my bash profile. So this is my bash profile. It's in my home folder. And that last line is setting that variable, pgdata, so that after I start a new terminal, it sets that variable. And then when I run Postgres, it knows where to look for its data. Sound good?
Okay. I was trying to run like the ZSHRC, but I would get something like, oh, like file or directory couldn't be found.
I mean, if you're running ZSH as your shell, then the ZSHRC is probably where you need to put this, but maybe we can debug this offline.
Okay.
Yeah, everyone's system is a little different sometimes. Do we have any other questions? Questions, anything last minute?
I have a question.
Let's hear
So for the homework, it's saying that now that you've installed data, like in the read SQL queries, what data are we reading?
You're saying in this one SQL queries?
I think it's in read SQL. Read SQL.
That's gonna be my fault. I kind of read the you're not going to be working with data. Just make sure you understand the commands. So select, insert, update, delete. I think this was tied to some other challenge beforehand. So I'd say just go through this, make sure you understand the commands, and then do the SQL, other SQL exercises.
Cool.
Okay.
Thanks, Oliver.
Sorry.
You're gonna upload this video on the YouTube, right?
Yep.
Right. All right. Thank you.
Any other last minute questions? No? Okay. Well, thank you all for coming to my lecture. Love your questions, love the engagement. I'm looking forward to seeing the databases you design. So yeah, take care and enjoy your afternoon.